want to talk about addiction. I want to talk about depression. I want to talk about anxiety. I want to say some things that people aren't used to hearing said. Okay? Here's my perception of the concept of having anxiety issues, having depression issues, or being addicted to anything. Let me give some examples that we're used to hearing about. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, social media. Here's what I believe about all those things. Here's what I believe they all have in common. I believe ultimately they're the side effect of what happens when a person has a hole right here. They're missing something and they're trying to put something in that hole to make them feel complete. Why? Why are they doing that? Because something happened to them younger in life, maybe in their childhood, some sort of trauma that happened, and they never unpacked it. They never were able to sort it out with a counselor, a psychiatrist, etc. Instead, maybe even their own parents said, all right, we don't talk about this. So then that person grows up never knowing how to deal with that. So by default, they end up having anxiety issues, coping issues. They become depressed. They end up getting addicted to something. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge this. I think, especially in America, what do we want to do? We want to prescribe people medicine, big pharma, thank you for saving us. This will help me cope. But we're still not dealing with the actual issue, the thing that we didn't deal with before. And I think the opposite is true too, though. I think there's a lot of people who maybe had it pretty easy growing up. They never really had any kind of trauma in their life, and they never learned to deal with something. So when something comes along, they freak out, they get depressed or anxious, maybe even end up being addicted to something as a coping mechanism because they didn't psychologically ever cope with that thing. I think, I'm gonna go ahead and say this. So I grew up in the tail end of the Appalachians in Alabama, in a dry county. And I think it was always taught, by dry county I mean it was illegal to buy or sell alcohol within the county. So therefore you can imagine what would happen. People were very divided on the issue. Either you believed drinking alcohol was a sin and you're going to hell for it, or you were trying to cross the county line to go get some beer. That was what happened with that mentality. But I think built into that is, if you believed drinking alcohol was wrong, you also believe this about people who drink alcohol, that you may have the alcohol gene and you don't know, you may take that first sip and it's far from your last and now you're addicted to alcohol. Now, do I believe, for example, and I'm using alcohol as the prime example because I think that's the most emotional connection that people are going to have as I'm talking about addiction. Do I believe that certain people are more prone to become physically addicted to alcohol when they drink it compared to somebody like me who is not? Is there a connection there physically? Sure, I don't have a problem admitting that. But I also believe that people who end up becoming alcoholics are more likely to have had that traumatic event that they never dealt with, that they're trying to fill that hole in their lives. Okay? Now, I'm no expert. I'm just a YouTuber. I'm nobody important. But the challenge in this video is I would love to get feedback from people who are dealing with addiction issues, who are dealing with anxiety and depression. If that's you, then I want you to comment and tell me that I'm wrong. Say, no, Nick, I didn't have any kind of trauma in my life that I never dealt with. No, Nick, I learned to cope with things, but I was born this way, Nick. I can't help it. I can't help it that I'm an addict. I can't help it that I'm addicted to whatever the thing is. I can't help it that I have anxiety issues. I can't help it that I'm depressed. I want to hear someone say that completely detached from my theory about this unresolved trauma in life. Because that's what I believe. I believe that it's so culturally acceptable and normal that we're on medications to deal with anxiety and depression, and that people keep going back to their addictions of gambling, drugs, alcohol, pornography, whatever that vice is. But we're still not dealing with the actual issue. And you can stay medicated all day long and go to counseling all day long for your addictions or whatever. But even in that counseling, until you unpack the skeletons in the closet and learn to deal with that and acknowledge with that, to deal with, maybe it's something pretty cliche like your father wasn't around, or he was abusive, or some kind of daddy issue. Maybe your mom had issues and she wasn't there. Maybe there was abuse that happened and wasn't talked about, it wasn't dealt with. I think there's so many things that have never been dealt with in so many people's lives, and by default they end up going the route of depression, anxiety, addiction. One of those, maybe all of those, maybe two of those. I don't simply believe that people are born that way and that's what happens. I think something happened. People are trying to deal with it in different ways, coping mechanisms. Is there anyone watching this video who can say, no, Nick, you're wrong? It has nothing to do with a person psychologically not coping with something from their childhood or never learning to cope in general. Nick, you're wrong. Can you say that? If so, say it in the comments. Prove to me that I'm wrong. Because go ahead and make me a fool. Because it'd be pretty easy to. I'm someone who has no addictions, has never suffered from anxiety, and never suffered from depression. I have had to deal with some things in my life, and if I told you, maybe you'd think that's nothing compared to me, because you know what happened to me when I was 12. But then you'd be proving my point. You'd be proving my point that you've had it worse than me, and maybe you didn't deal with that. We all have things that happen to us in life that I wasn't even planning this for the video, but tonight I finished watching Moana with my kids because it's on Netflix right now. And at the very end, spoiler alert, I'm ruining Moana for you. So go ahead and turn the video off now if you don't want to learn how the movie ends. But the main, I guess, villain of the movie, Moana, like, parts the water, like Moses in the Red Sea or whatever, and goes to her and says, these things that happen to you, they don't define you. They don't define you. These things that happen to you don't define you. At that moment, this shell breaks away and the villain becomes a good person, because they realize they weren't defined by that bad thing that happened to them that they had no control over. It's the same thing as that. I think culture in America teaches us that you're just born that way, and that's just how some people are, and you can't help it. But I say, what about the root of the problem? What about us acknowledging these things that we're not talking about? Because it's easier for someone to brush it off and say, you have a condition, let's get you the right medication. We all have issues, but I don't think all of us cope with them and deal with them in the same way. And some people get over things and have horrible things happen to them growing up, and they end up all right because they somehow learned to cope, compared to the same people who went through just as horrible things and didn't have a way to cope with that. I'm hoping that people actually watch this video, because this is something that's very real to me. I'm going to close by saying this, and this is me kind of behind the scenes. As a YouTuber, one of my struggles is the difference between being real and being relevant. If I only talked about the things that I want to talk about, like this, in this video, then my channel wouldn't be as popular. So being real isn't enough. It's also about being relevant. It's about making videos that people are going to watch. That's why I make so many videos about Meghan Markle and biracial and Spain and Mexican, all these DNA tests, things that are going to draw people in. I need to be relevant to draw in the crowd. But if it were up to me, I would be talking more about stuff like this, because this is fascinating to me. This is complex to me. But most people won't watch this video, especially not this far into it, to know that. Anyway, I'm a real person behind the whole YouTube thing. And I wish I could talk more about this. Okay, go ahead. Tell me that I'm wrong. Tell me that I'm completely off. Tell me that I grew up too privileged to ever know, and that go ahead and curse me out and all those things. But ultimately, I still believe I'm onto something. All right, go for it. Comments right here.